Our speaker tonight comes to us from Fordham University, where he holds a named chair, the Father John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Chair of Orthodox Christian Studies. To say that he is a powerhouse in the history of Christianity in late antiquity would be a gross misunderstatement. By my count, he has published 7 books in the last 14 years. My colleagues in the audience will know just how astounding a rate of production that is, 7 books in 14 years. Among many other areas of interest, including the history of the papacy, he has focused on the important topic of Christian East and Western relations in the Middle Ages, culminating in his most recent book, Colonizing Christianity, Greek and Latin Religious Identity in the Era of the Fourth Crusade. He's also currently working on yet another fascinating book, Christian Hymns of Violence, Before and After Islam. As if this were not enough, he has been a leading figure in promoting the study of Orthodox Christian studies. He is the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and the co-founder of a leading journal in the field. You can also follow him on Twitter under George Demacopoulos, where in addition to announcements in the field of Christian studies, you will find effusive tweets celebrating the success of our beloved Red Sox. Even though he lives in New York. Think about that. Tonight, our speaker turns to a topic that emphasizes the cultural continuity between what we might call 2 Greek worlds, the ancient and the Christian. And yet, rather than breaking decisively with the past, the Christian world negotiated with and often employed the same cultural ways of thinking from earlier periods. If nothing else, our speaker's work reminds us that the present is shaped by the past and how we actually think about reshaping that past. And so I present to you Dr. George Demacopoulos, the fall 2021 lecturer for the Rouman Lecture Series. Please join me in giving him a hand.
Good evening, everyone. So my title this evening is Repurposing Classical Drama in the Age of Justinian, St. Romanos the Melodist. I must begin, of course, by thanking my generous hosts for the invitation. Christos and Mary Papuzzi, the patrons of this event, Dr. John Rouman, for whom the lecture series is named, the Faculty of Classics here at the University of New Hampshire. I would especially like to extend my appreciation to Mary Papuzzi and to Scott Smith, Chair of Classics, Humanities, and Italian Studies, who have been extraordinary in the preparation for this event. I would also like to recognize the presence of President Dean, Mr. Gardner, Mr. Efthimiou, Mr. and Mrs. Gatsoulis, and my dear friend, Dr. Jim Rouman, the medical doctor, who are joining us this evening. It is a genuine pleasure and honor for me to deliver this lecture. I hope that I am able to live up to your expectations. My lecture this evening is rather straightforward. I will be arguing that, contrary to the general scholarly opinion, Athenian drama did not come to an end at the close of antiquity, nor was Christianity fundamentally opposed to the classical dramatic tradition. On the contrary, I will show that a Christian dramatic tradition not only existed, but thrived at the precise time in history when the Roman Empire was purging the public square of other pagan traditions, symbols, and rituals. Specifically, I'll be analyzing a pair of religious poems crafted by the great Constantinopolitan hymnographer, St. Romanos the Melodist, to argue that several notable features of Athenian drama were alive and well during the apex of the Byzantine Empire, the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Indeed, Romanos's hymns have so much in common with the Athenian theater that one of my colleagues recently referred to them as Byzantine Broadway. As a quick aside, for those of you who may not know this, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire are the same thing. Near the end of my lecture, I'll have something to say about the confusion regarding that difference. It's always good to let your audience know what to expect, so my lecture will proceed in the following way. After a quick introduction to Romanos and the hymnographic form he made popular, the kondakion, I'll provide an overview of the similarities and differences between classical drama and Romanos' hymns. I will then offer a more detailed analysis of two of his most fascinating and dramatic hymns, the Lament of the Mother of God and On the Victory of the Cross, in order to demonstrate the specific ways in which Romanos repurposed dramatic forms for theological purposes. The handout you've received offers an English translation of both of these hymns. I will then conclude with a few observations about the transmission of the classical world through early Christianity and down to the present age. All right, so, St. Romanos the Melodist. Most of what we think we know of Romanos' life derives from sources that were composed several hundred years after his death. Scholars generally agree that he was born at the end of the 5th century in Emesa, that's modern-day Syria, and that he was ordained to the clergy in the city of Beirut, modern-day Lebanon, before moving to Constantinople in the early part of the 6th century. In Constantinople, Romanos served a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary until his death, which occurred sometime after the year 553 of the Common Era. It is generally assumed that he came from a Jewish background and converted to Christianity as a young adult. Whatever his religious ancestry, there is little doubt that Romanos' development of the kondakion, hymnographic form, owes a great deal to the religious matrix of late antique Syria, where Jewish and Christian communities were in close proximity, and for whom there was a great deal of cross-fertilization of interpretive and lyrical forms. All right, so what's a kondakion? The kondakion form of hymnography flourished in the early Byzantine period and was unique to the city of Constantinople. Kondakia possess several notable features that differentiate them from other Greek language hymns of early or medieval Christianity. Most notably, kondakia are quite long, 18 to 24 stanzas, usually. And they function as a kind of sung sermon in versed metrical form. Ask your priest or minister to do that this Sunday, right? To sing their sermon as a poem, right? On the spot, extemporaneously. A kondakion typically consists of one or more preludes, followed by metrically identical stanzas, each of which connect to one another by a short refrain. The first stanza, known as the irmos, functions as the model stanza in that it indicates to the singers both the melody and the metrical pattern for the rest of the hymn that will follow. The opening letter of each stanza formed an acrostic. Think back to English what an acrostic is. It's when you have a pattern in poetry or some other lyrical form where the first letter of each stanza has its own kind of embedded code, all right? For Romanos, the acrostic typically spells out the humble Romanos. And the entire set of stanzas, that's how we know which ones are actually his, because the acrostic lines up, right? And the entire set of stanzas followed a complex metrical structure based upon patterns of stressed or unstressed syllables. Ordinarily, kondakia were sung during an evening service in anticipation of a major Christian feast the following day. It is generally assumed that a single chanter or cleric would sing the stanzas from a raised pulpit in the middle of the church, and a choir or perhaps the whole congregation would respond with each refrain. As a sung sermon, a kondakion was exegetical, meaning that it functioned as an explanation of a story from the Bible. But unlike typical biblical commentaries of the early church, kondakia unleashed new possibilities for interpretation because they used dramatization, especially speech in character, what the ancient Greeks called ethopeia, to expand the biblical scene with invented conversations and actions not included in the actual biblical text. One of my doctoral students keenly refers to this as a kind of biblical fan fiction. By employing speech in character, kondakia opened additional layers of meaning for the audience, in much the same way that an ancient dramatist like Euripides expanded upon the canonical text of Homer to introduce new storylines and themes of the original epic. So too, Romanos used his kondakia to introduce entirely new engagements between biblical characters, not contained within the biblical texts, in order to show different sides to characters and draw out new, creative, inventive theological meaning. Through these techniques, Romanos provided new storylines to characters that were well known, such as the Virgin Mary or St. Peter. But he also gave voice and psychological depth to characters mentioned only briefly by the canonical text, some characters who don't even have speaking lines, like King Herod, the Magi, or the sinful woman who washes Jesus' feet. More than any other hymnographic form developed during the Middle Ages, Romanos' kondakia enable a deep probing of religious emotion and the psychological state of biblical characters, heroes and villains. The inclusion of a refrain between each stanza allowed for community engagement with this psychological state, without requiring the audience to have knowledge of ancient poetic forms or theological training. Before I proceed to a more direct comparison between Romanos and ancient drama, I do need to offer a few words about the state of classical drama in the Roman Empire at the time Romanos was writing, which was during the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Long before Christianity, the staged performance of Athenian drama had been in decline. The decline is generally believed to have begun with Athens' loss in the Peloponnesian War, 400 years before the birth of Jesus. When Christianity eventually gained influence in imperial circles following the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine 300 years after Jesus, the new religion likely expedited the demise of large-scale productions of classical compositions. Several Christian preachers, famous ones, such as the early 5th century Archbishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, railed against the theater, in part because of its origin within the cult of pagan idols, but also because John Chrysostom believed that the storylines of the ancient dramas encouraged immoral behavior. When the Roman Emperor Justinian assumed the imperial throne in the year 527, more than any emperor before him, he forged a permanent connection between Christianity and the empire through legislation. Among other legal moves, Justinian closed the famous Academy of Athens that had been started by Socrates, and he criminalized pagan religion. As Anthony Caldelis has explained, by the 6th century, the very name Hellene had become reduced to a rhetorical stand-in for any idolatrous practice. As a consequence, no self-respecting Christian could self-define as a Hellene, no matter how many cultural aspects of Hellenism survived within his or her actual Christian practice. So, for example, even though various forms of acting continued, and the classical dramatists like Sophocles and Euripides were studied in school, the production of ancient plays effectively came to an end during Justinian's reign. Given all of this, I believe that the close connections between Romanos's hymns and classical drama is all the more remarkable. Okay, so let's talk about some obvious differences between classical drama and these hymns. If we are going to define drama in such a way that it requires staging with multiple actors, then Romanos's Kondakia are not dramas. His Kondakia were neither staged, nor were they enacted by multiple masked actors, as had been the classical tradition. Rather, they were solo performances by a singer who offered a narrative that employed dramatic elements. Another notable difference concerns the use of meter. Both classical drama and Romanos's hymns employ poetic meter, but they do so in different ways. Whereas classical drama incorporated patterns of pitched accents and long and short syllables, the meter of Romanos's hymns, like all Byzantine poetry, relied solely on patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. There was no pitch differentiation. A third difference is that of genre. Whereas Athenian drama consisted of three distinctive forms, tragedy, comedy, and satire, Romanos's hymns do not fit any of those categories. To be sure, Romanos employs both comedic and tragic elements. He even combines them in ways that the ancients never did. But his dramatic retelling of biblical scenes was not tragic, was not comedic, and was not satirical. All right, on to the similarities. So while there are clearly important structural differences between classical drama and the hymns of Romanos, there are so many ways in which they are similar, both in terms of their form and in terms of their public function. Regarding the similarities of form, no less an authority than Aristotle, the first author to attempt an analysis of drama, was not so concerned to define drama in terms of staging or actors, but rather he emphasized drama's mimesis of action and characters. To achieve this mimesis, Aristotle believed that the two most important features of drama were scene recognition, the narrative mechanism by which an audience understands the dramatic setting, and the reversal of circumstance, a plot device whereby some new information or plot development changes the situation of the characters in unexpected ways. For Aristotle, these features were the most important because they allowed an audience to join the story and share the emotions of fear or pity or levity enacted by the characters. When scholars who work on Romanos point to the dramatic elements of his Kondakia, they tend to focus solely on his use of speech in character, ethopeia, because it is this device, more than any other, that enables the dramatic expansion of a biblical scene, or the psychological investigation of a biblical villain or hero. It is also likely that they focus on the speech and character dynamic of the Kondakia, because it is this element that most differentiates Kondakia from other types of Christian hymns. Other hymns don't use speech and character, or do so very, very rarely. It's only Kondakia that do this. But there are several other aspects of Romanos's Kondakia beyond speech and character that reflect a repurposing of classical drama. Just like the ancient Athenian dramatists, Romanos employs the features that were so significant to Aristotle, that is, scene recognition, anagnorisis, and reversal of circumstance, peripetia. In the same way that Sophocles, Euripides, or Aeschylus were able to convey deep philosophical principles and psychological insights to unrefined audiences through dramatic productions, so too Romanos was able to create and dramatize imaginary biblical scenes. Like Athenian drama, Romanos' stories occur in media res, within a familiar canonical story. And like those dramas, he turns his characters in new directions to answer unanswered questions, much the same way that a fan fiction author fills in the missing gaps of a beloved but seemingly incomplete epic story. In addition to these mechanical similarities, it is also worth noting that Romanos' hymns served many of the same civic functions once performed by classical drama. For starters, we should not lose sight of the fact that Athenian drama was, first and foremost, an act of religious devotion. Not only did many of the stories derive from Homeric epic and routinely engage the Olympian pantheon, but the very origins of the Athenian theater lie in an annual, citywide, cultic devotion to the god Dionysius. There is even a connection between the Greco-Roman and Christian use of religious hymns in civic celebrations. Indeed, prior to Christianity's rise and hegemonic control of public ritual, classical civic festivals had featured both oratory and hymns, pagan hymns, which were performed as part of the public religious celebration. With Romanos' festal hymns, the content had certainly changed. It now conveyed Christian teaching, but the connection between religious ritual, annual commemoration, and civic engagement functioned in much the same way that it had in classical Athens. These connections between Greco-Roman and Christian public performance become all the more apparent when we look more carefully at the way that Christians spoke about and enacted their own rituals. A 5th century Christian bishop, Basil of Seleucia, referred to the divine liturgy as a theater. Even the staging of a singer on or underneath the central ambo, the pulpit in the middle of the church, suggests a liturgical appropriation of a dramatic stage. As the Romanos expert Thomas Arenson notes, the stage and the church both attempted to present marvelous or mythological stories in dramatic ways accompanied by song. So let us turn now to two examples that I hope will illuminate my contention that Romanos' hymns evince a Christian repurposing of classical drama for theological effect. The first hymn I would like to analyze is known as On the Lament of the Mother of God. This hymn, which is the first in your handout, is set in 17 stanzas. It imagines a conversation between Jesus and his mother at the time of the crucifixion in order to explain the theological purpose of Christ's physical suffering and death. It is noteworthy that Romanos' reimagining of the event erases the presence of the apostles, whereas the gospel accounts all chronicle Christ's engagements with the disciples and largely ignore Mary. In this hymn, the Virgin alone is the witness of and spokesperson for the events of the crucifixion. Throughout the hymn, Mary gives voice to the grief of the community, but does so in a particularly maternal feminine way. We may even say that Romanos' elaboration of Mary's anguish has more in common with the psychological realism of one of Euripides' dramas than it does other Christian hymns about Mary, especially the more ascetic and otherworldly accounts of the Virgin that we find in later Christian hymnographers, such as St. Andrew of Crete. Throughout the hymn, Romanos pits Mary's grief against the necessity for Christ's violent death. Romanos, through the imagined voice of Christ, insists that his suffering and death are the remedy of death. They are the pathway to salvation. While the theological stress of the hymn lies with this explanation, the dramatic emphasis remains focused on Mary's grief, a heart-wrenching grief that we might liken to emotional violence. The Virgin anticipates the pain and death of her child in real time as it unfolds, an experience that would have been all too common for the men and women who comprised Romanos' audience. Over and again, Mary, who does not want her son to suffer and knows of his power, questions why he would allow himself to endure such pain at the hands of evil men. At one point, Mary asks why it could be the case that Christ can raise the dead and perform all sorts of miracles, but cannot grant salvation to humanity without dying himself. Romanos' Mary speaks not only for herself, but for all Christians, not only those who are theologically confused by Christ's suffering, but also those who watch their own children suffer. By the end of the hymn, Romanos has achieved his theological point. The need for Christ's suffering is explained in terms of the cosmic plan for salvation. But the hymn does something that no previous Christian hymn had ever done. Romanos effectively invents the notion of Marian lament. Even though Mary consents to her son's will and tacitly accepts his explanation for his suffering, she never sets aside her grief. Romanos neither ignores nor belittles Mary's grief, as all previous Christian interpreters had. Rather, he instructs her to give her sorrow over to her son. Christ's strength, a strength made manifest through his suffering, is sufficient to absorb Mary's grief. For Thomas Arenson, the conclusion of the hymn suggests that Mary's weeping voice has turned into something powerful. She has become a partner in Christ's death and resurrection by giving voice to it. Mary does not endure the violence of the cross, but she is its lone spokesperson, and as such, she is a participant. The hymn ends by emphasizing both Christ's suffering and his gift of voice to the Virgin. The second half of the final stanza, page 150 on your handout, I have a little arrow pointed to it. The point of view has shifted. It's no longer Mary and Christ speaking. It has shifted to the audience singing. That's typically what happens in the final stanza. And so now it's everybody singing. Like a lamb, you took away our sins, putting them to death by your slaughter, O Savior. You saved everyone. You are both in suffering and not in suffering. You are dying and saving. You granted the honored lady the freedom of speech to cry to you, my son and my God. So throughout the entire hymn, every stanza ends with Mary singing, my son, my God, my son, my God, my son, my God. That's the refrain. But now in the very final stanza, Romanos is having the whole community take on the voice that Mary invents, right? Because Mary's cry is the cry of the refrain, the cry of the people, Mary's empowered voice becomes their own. What began as a cry of grief, a cry of despair, concludes as a cry of anticipation for the resurrection. Lament is not forgotten. It is transformed into a sorrowful joy. Whereas many of Romanos's contemporaries emphasized the Virgin's ascetic qualities and her meekness, Romanos's Mary is, by comparison, a bold and strong woman. Her powerful voice becomes the voice of the people, and through her, the public proclaims its anticipation of Christ's resurrection. On the victory of the cross. Romanos's Kontakia on the victory of the cross is, to my mind, the most unique and rewarding of all of his hymns. There are approximately 59 that survive that we believe are authentically his. This is my favorite. Likely composed for Good Friday and set in 18 stanzas, the Kontakion functions as a dialogue, wait for it, between Satan and the personification of hell, who are off stage at the beginning of Christ's crucifixion. Hell and Satan argue with one another as they both watch and experience the events as they unfold. Drawing on the classical dramatic notion of anagnorisis, scene recognition, Romanos effortlessly creates two simultaneous scenes for his audience. One is familiar, Golgotha, the site of Christ's crucifixion, described in all the Gospels. The other is more elusive, a subterranean, off-stage setting where an anthropomorphic Satan and the personification of hell bicker with one another. The second scene, of course, has no biblical referent. It is a creation of Romanos's theological imagination. As the Kontakion unfolds, the audience is moved back and forth between the two scenes, but is asked to recall several episodes from the Hebrew Bible as well. Because hell and Satan are granted all of the dialogue in the hymn, the audience is led to interpret the canonical Gospels through the lens of the invented subterranean conversation by non-humans. In addition to speech and character and scene recognition, the other obvious characteristic from Athenian drama that Romanos employs is that of peripetia, reversal of circumstance. Indeed, the entire Kontakion hinges, somewhat comically, on Satan's transition from thinking that the crucifixion is a moment of victory to realizing that it is, in fact, the completion of his own defeat. The hymn opens with hell exclaiming that he has been pierced in the stomach by a lance. The lance is at one and the same time the tree from which Adam ate and the cross upon which Christ hangs. Satan, who cannot see or feel hell's affliction, criticizes hell's unexpected fear and tries to convince him that the crucifixion of Jesus is a reason for celebration. For several stanzas, the debate between Satan and hell carries on, with each speaking past the other. Hell is wailing in agony, while Satan remains adamant that his companion is concerned without cause. At the midpoint of the Kontakion, the debate between hell and Satan abruptly transitions because the events of Christ's crucifixion have unfolded. Satan now understands that the cross has vanquished the power of death. The dead are being released from hell. This is the moment of peripetia. Circumstances have changed. Stanzas 10 to 16 offer Satan's lament at the loss of his power and at his own foolishness for not seeing the multiple prophecies of a triumphant cross in the Hebrew Bible. On the victory of the cross is arguably the most creative and dramatic of Romanos's Kondakia, in part because it employs features of classical drama that are not as fully developed as in other hymns. For example, Romanos not only anthropomorphizes Satan and hell, but he also tempts his audience to both feel sorry for them and to laugh at them. In much the same way that Euripides could make his audience sympathize with a crazed and violent figure like Medea, so too Romanos transforms the very dwelling of the dead into a human-like character that both interacts with and is acted upon by the Passion of Christ. Rather than instruct the audience how to interpret the theological significance of the crucifixion explicitly, Romanos advances his creative theological concerns through drama, through the transformation of the offstage characters of hell and Satan and their voiced reactions to their own transformation. Like Athenian drama, the recognition is told in retrospect. Satan's final recognition that he had been wrong all along is extolled through the use of past tense verbs. Satan laments, "I did not believe. I saw the tree. I shuddered." In sum, the hymn encapsulates the very qualities that Aristotle had identified as the foundation of drama. It is both a hallmark and an unfortunate reality of the modern academic enterprise that knowledge of the past is not only segmented by disciplinary boundaries, religion versus history versus philosophy, literature, philology, but also by periodization, ancient, medieval, modern. In my corner of the academic world, these sorts of fragmentations not only do their ordinary damage, but they have actually compounded to exaggerate a dichotomy between a classical Roman Empire and its Eastern and Christian successor that we typically know by the name of Byzantium. The word Byzantine is, for all intents and purposes, a scholarly invention. The people we call Byzantine always, and by always I mean always, self-defined as Romans. And it is worth noting that the scholarly separation of Byzantium from Rome was not innocent. In fact, it was a direct response to Western European interests in southeastern Europe during the 19th century. And it was accompanied by a host of cultural and religious biases. In effect, the academic separation between the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire was a deliberate effort to differentiate an enlightened, secular, and humanistic classical world, which is the way Western Europeans saw themselves, from a superstitious, prudish, and oriental Byzantium, which is the way that Western Europeans saw Orthodox Christianity. Like most historiographical moves, the bifurcation between Rome and Byzantium tells us more about the scholars who engineered it than it actually tells us about the civilization they studied. Now you might be asking yourself, especially the students, why is this guy talking about 19th century scholarly designations? Wasn't he just talking about hymns and drama? I raise the Rome-Byzantium quagmire now, not because I want to lecture about the problems of academic periodization and nomenclature, but because I need to stress that this sharp distinction between the classical world and Byzantium that drives the popular imagination is not only culturally biased, but it directly impacts our ability to see the continuation of Hellenism in Christian sources, precisely like we find in Romanos the Melodist. More than anything else, the Rome-Byzantine dichotomy is predicated on a secular, Western, scholarly assumption that Christianity not only changed the classical world beyond recognition, but that there were characteristics of this particular form of Christianity, Eastern, mystical, etc., that were so degenerative that it required a different name. I am a historian of Christianity. I can fully appreciate that its emergence changed the course of history, that it changed the course of Roman history. But I also know enough about the Greco-Roman world, particularly with respect to the way that religion functioned in that world, to know that there was far more continuity between the classical world and the civilization we call Byzantium than we typically assume. While it is certainly true that the content of Greco-Roman religion and early Christianity were distinctive, there are also more continuities between them than we might appreciate, especially on the popular level. But for the argument I'm trying to make this evening, I don't even need for you to understand that there are religious continuities. I simply need you to appreciate that religion functioned similarly in both societies. One of the great mistakes we make in the modern world is to presume that Christians were more serious about their religion than their ancient predecessors. True enough, many Christians were willing to die for their faith through martyrdom, and there really is no cognate in the Greco-Roman world for Christian martyrdom. But that in and of itself does not prove that Christianity was any more pervasive in the lives of its followers than the Greco-Roman religions. Indeed, the whole of ancient Greek politics, art, literature, and drama were steeped in religious thought and religious cultic practice. The inhabitants of Sophocles' Athens were no more or no less religious than those of Justinian's Constantinople. Athenian drama was fundamentally an act of public religion, from composition to competition to performance to attendance. It was an annual ritual that entertained, educated, and united the community under the banner of public religious observance. If you can follow my line of reasoning that in terms of civic function, Athenian drama was fundamentally a religious act, then it is my hope that you can at least entertain the possibility that Romanos's religious hymns were not so different in civic function, even if the content of those hymns was quite different. Like Athenian dramas, Romanos's Holy Week hymns were a part of an annual ritual that entertained, educated, and united the community under the banner of public religious observance. So if you're still with me, and you can accept the possibility that the civic function of Romanos's Kondakia were sufficiently comparable to the stage productions of Aeschylus or Euripides, then it is my hope that you can agree with me that the actual dynamics of these hymns bear remarkable similarities to the classical stage. Indeed, in so many ways, Romanos's hymns rely upon the features of classical drama to entertain and educate. The use of speech in character, ethopoeia, is the most obvious feature. It allowed Romanos, like his Athenian predecessors, to expand upon the biblical text in dramatic, creative ways. But there were additional elements equally important, such as scene recognition and reversal of circumstance. Through these devices, Romanos was able to explore the emotional or psychological sides of Christian heroes and villains, including Christ himself, in ways that made them more tangible, relatable, personal, and compelling. If we are to understand the legacy and relevance of Hellenism in our own day, then we must move past the false dichotomies that prevail in the public imagination with respect to the ways in which Christianity is thought to have transformed the classical world overnight. We must understand that Christians were no more religious than their Greco-Roman predecessors, even if the content of their beliefs was different. We must also understand that key facets of Hellenistic life, like drama, were repurposed by Christians with extraordinary success, not only in terms of their popularity — Romanos is the most famous of all Byzantine hymnographers — but also in terms of their literary genius. Romanos' hymns are some of the most impressive works of art in the entire history of Christianity. They represent the very best form of a Christianized Hellenism. They are, as my colleague would say, Byzantine Broadway at its finest. If you'll permit me one final observation, in much the same way that we as a society fail to see the continuity between the Hellenistic world and the early Christian, so too do we fail to appreciate the way in which the study of the classics helps us to understand and make sense of our own world and its challenges. There is simply no other civilization in the history of the world that has impacted the present more fundamentally than that of ancient Greece and Rome. Whether we are talking about religion, politics, philosophy, literature, art, architecture — I can go on and on, just name every department you have at the university. There is little doubt that our ability to face the challenges and polarization of the present requires us to have a more robust engagement with the classical past specifically, and the humanities in general. This is because a humanities education not only instills the student with a greater appreciation for dissenting views, but because it helps to dispel so many false narratives about the past that can be deployed for evil purposes, particularly when it comes to religion, which circulate within the echo chambers of our partisan world. Did you know that philosophy and theology majors score higher than any other students on the LSAT? Did you know that classics majors and double majors have a greater chance of getting into medical school than science majors? These are true. The classical world continued through the Middle Ages. Yes, it was Christianized, but it continued in authors like Romanos and so many others. It lives in our own world too, in more ways than most of us appreciate. We need to invest more rather than less in classical studies, and we will learn just how rich and rewarding it is. Thank you.
Can we take your questions?
Sure.
I have a microphone, so I will walk around. I think we have a question right here already. So, Marsha, there you go.
Hi, thank you. Wow, that was so interesting. Thank you so much. Listen, what you said I thought was, everything was interesting, but I thought that your that what you were saying about the way historians kind of have almost a Western-centric view,
Yeah.
and made a false dichotomy between what is Roman and what is Hellenist, I guess, is really a function of bias.
Yeah.
Now, the way of proving that, I query, is how do Indian subcontinent view Christianity's development? How do the Chinese view Christian development? So if they don't see that dichotomy, then maybe you're right. But if they do see that dichotomy, maybe there's something to it. And I'm wondering, has there ever been any kind of cross-cultural, sociological look at early Christianity from that more globalistic perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so you raised like so many issues in one question. Right, so in some ways what you're getting into really is what's known in the academic world as kind of post-colonial critique, right? I know I'm just throwing out jargon now, but so for example, right, I mean, the point I was trying to make is that in the Western frame, we're all in the Western frame. In the Western frame, whether we realize it or not, we have preconceived notions that are predicated on sense of cultural superiority. Every culture does that, right? But this is what defines the dominant narrative in the Western Academy, okay? And what I'm talking about is how, in one example, that sort of undermines our ability to actually understand what happened because we bring those prejudices into the filters by which we try to interpret the past. Now, you're asking, is the same sort of thing happen with respect to Christianity, where Christianity spread through mission, India, China, so forth and so on? Okay, so there is a whole world of scholarship that works precisely on that. And one of the interesting, but I'm going to bring it back to Byzantium and I'll explain how. One of the interesting things about that is, so Christianity was actually in India and in China in the Middle Ages. But it came again in new forms when Western Europeans began the colonial endeavor. And so Christianity, mostly in India and China, only came via colonization, right? And so there was an entire generation of scholars who saw that as bad, and by definition were only able to understand Christianity as a colonizing agent rather than as a colonizing victim. But again, this is because nobody pays attention to this thing we call Byzantium. Because if you pay attention to this thing called Byzantium, there's actually a history that predates all of that by about 600 years, where indigenous Christians were actually the victims. Like, Christianity begins in the Middle East. This is something we forget about, right? Christianity is intrinsically a Middle Eastern religion that spread elsewhere. So when the Crusaders come and colonize the Middle East, you have this incredible reversal of the colonial process, which is really my very long way of saying, yes, the kind of thing you're asking about, there are lots of scholars who work on this, yeah.
We have a question in the back, and I'll be bringing it back to the front in a second.
So, in your argument against these false dichotomies and the blurring of the continuities between different periods of time, do you think that fighting for this is feasible in the current state of academia? And does this translate to things beforehand? So something that I'm thinking about is the continuity between ancient Egypt and Ptolemaic Egypt, for example. And then me as a young scholar, what can I do in my foray into the academic world to break down these false dichotomies and to bring a more accurate frame to the study of history?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, the modern scholarly enterprise is constantly evolving. So I do absolutely think that it is the case that the trajectory can change, things can get corrected, and so forth. The Byzantine one, I refer to it as a quagmire because that's precisely what it is. I mean, so I belong to the North American Byzantine Association, whatever. I can't even remember the own name. And now I'm on the board and I can't even remember the name of it. Anyway, the challenge we face there is a little different because, so we have the president of the university here tonight, right? If I tell him all of a sudden, well, don't hire a Byzantinist, but don't call him a Byzantinist, he's just going to get confused, right? Like if you go to a dean and say, that person that you hired for Byzantine art because all of your donors and all of your faculty said you have to have somebody who does Byzantine art, but now you want it to be called East Roman, it just confuses them, right? And so that's why in this particular case we're really in a mess, because even if the word has all of this baggage to it and this cultural, like these built-in biases, and it fragments our ability to talk about the continuity of Hellenism and Byzantium, right? And fragments our ability to talk about the continuity between Christianity and the classical world. It nonetheless is useful, because if we say Byzantium, people kind of know what we're talking about. But if we just say medieval East Roman, nobody has any idea what we're talking about. I don't know the particular, I don't know enough detail about the particular example you gave to render an opinion, other than to say, as somebody who's been in the field for a long time now, the situation in my corner of the world is not unique, and the one in your corner of the world is probably not unique. And, you know, what I would recommend is when you're at conferences, just getting together and having roundtables and have, you know, or try to get 3 or 4 people together and pitch a special issue of a journal with different points of view on what to do about the nomenclature. Yeah.
Excuse me, let me thank you for a very wonderful lecture. I was very pleased. And I want to first answer this lady over here. Actually, if you look at the present situation in the world, in Thailand and Bangkok, the Russian Orthodox Church has actually 3 churches with native clergy, Thai clergy,
yeah.
So that it has been no great difficulty in Orthodox Christianity adjusting to the Thai people. And the king is mentioned in the Divine Liturgy.
Yeah.
And so, but my big question to you is, you said something about that Christianity has themes that the ancient world doesn't have, and I was just thinking, what do you? I mean, I think that, let us say, Antigone by Sophocles, it represents a theme that is illustrates martyrdom in a way that a Christian would clearly understand. So I don't think that I hope I understood you correctly, but I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think what I was, obviously that's a, right, that's I guess I was talking about the actual martyrdoms of Christians versus the actual practice of any cognate in the Greco-Roman world, not necessarily what happens in literature and so forth. But yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, because everyone can spy the cookies and coffee to your right.
Thank you. And thank you for the talk. I'd like to bring it back a little bit to Romanos and the sort of continuity between classical Greece and Rome. Now, as I'm seeing it, what you're saying is that this is basically another link in the chain. The late antiquity is another link in the chain of classical drama. Now, my question, though, is just at what point does it become something different?
Yeah.
At what point, because you mentioned that the content is obviously Christian theme rather than classical or Homeric theme. That's different. The form is also, it's got a lot of the same techniques, yeah. Which it kind of makes sense because it's serving the same purpose. But even the whole idea of drama and comedy, the abandonment of that, at what point is it different? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a great question that would probably, there are people in the room who study drama, and I don't, who could probably answer that better than I do. I mean, the broader point that I'm trying, like, I will acknowledge that it's not the same thing, right? It is definitely not the same thing, right? This is an exegetical, right? It's a religious sermon performed by a single person, right? It's not a stage, it's not actors, and so forth, right?
Just quickly,
yeah.
Where did it perform? Because I was a little bit unsure of that.
Yeah, so it was, so Romanos was the deacon He's just a deacon, not even a priest. He was the deacon of a mid-sized church in the city of Constantinople. He performed these as solo performances while he was alive, but they were so famous that people were literally writing them down as he was doing them, and then they performed them for another maybe 500 or 600 years. And then actually, these are not performed anymore in the Orthodox Church. Right? It's a great irony that the greatest hymnographer in the Orthodox Christian tradition, we don't sing any of his hymns, right? Because they moved on to another form that was shorter and anyway. When does it become something else? I mean, so I would say that it is something else, and yet there's so much of it that's living on. Right, I'm going to pull the classical teacher thing and challenge the question, right? In other words, I would say there never was a time when drama was a single thing. Drama was always evolving, right? The drama of Euripides' time, right? You talk about Euripides as being a different kind of playwright because he was doing things in new ways. There were people at the time of Euripides who thought that what he was doing was not the right way to do drama, right? And so all of these things are constantly evolving, right? So at one and the same time, I would say it's already not that thing, but there never was a stable thing. And yet, we can see so much of it still alive and being repurposed for new purpose, for new things. Yeah.
One more question, and then we have a presentation. So.
Okay.
Hello, yeah, I'll keep it short and sweet. But the question that I had is, so, since we have the written text and because of cultural transmission, do you think there's a possibility that Romanos's, what was the word for it again? Apologies, the type of poem that he does?
Kontakia.
Kontakia. Do you think there's a possibility that these might have inspired the later actual Christian drama traditions of, example, morality plays like Everyman, pageant plays that you would have in front of churches, as well as even later like Christopher Marlowe, where in Dr. Faustus has scenes where he like depicts, similar to the victory of the cross, demons like Mephistopheles who depict a scene of we have been conquered by Christ and we are in this pitiable misery. There's a pathos there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I am sure there are people out there who know the answer to that. I'm not one of them. I mean, so you have to know that all of the examples you gave come from the Latin Church or its successors, whereas Romanos was writing in Greek. I honestly don't know whether or not Romanos was translated into Latin. I've never heard that he was. Was he? He was. Okay, so 13th, 14th century, there are some translations of Romanos. Okay, yeah, whether it's a direct influence on them, I don't know, or if that's the cause for the resurgence of the passion plays or the Christmas plays or whatever. I don't know. I doubt it, but maybe. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I want to ask the speaker to stay up here, but I'm going to invite the co-chair of the board, Mary Papuzzi, you've heard about her several times, to make a presentation.
What a wonderful evening. We can't thank the speaker enough, and I have to say this is the second time he accepted our invitation to come. He was scheduled last fall. Because of the pandemic, we had to postpone. I've got it backwards. We have a crystal plaque here for him to thank him for his attendance. He'll be also giving a specialized lecture tomorrow for the faculty and advanced students. But thank you for an enlightening lecture, and thank you for coming all the way from New York. Thank you very, very much.